All right, let's dive in. We're looking at a really fascinating development today in how large language models learn and improve.
Yeah, this paper on test time reinforcement learning, or TTRL, caught my eye too.
Exactly. So the hook here for you listening is this. Imagine an LLM getting significantly better at complex stuff, like really hard math problems, using only the unlabeled test questions themselves.
That's the core idea. No extra training labels needed at test time.
And the clever bit is how the model basically generates a bunch of answers, figures out which one is the most popular, majority rules.
Right, majority voting.
And then uses that popular answer as its own reward signal to get better through reinforcement learning while it's taking the test.
It's a kind of self-improvement loop, happening right there at inference time.
Leading to some pretty wild results. They mention a 159% accuracy boost on a tough math benchmark with one model, the Quen 2.5 Math 7B.
Which is huge, especially considering how it's achieved.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to break down cutting-edge research, like this paper, and pull out the key insights for you, especially if you're in the AI research or engineering space.
And today, it's all about enhancing AI reasoning, specifically in these technical areas like math, using this novel TTRL approach.
You shared this paper, and it hits on a really critical point, doesn't it? How do we make these LLMs smarter for new challenges without drowning in the need for labeled data?
Absolutely. That's a constant struggle, especially as the models get more complex and the tasks get harder. Keeping up with labeling is just, often impractical. TTRL offers a potential way around that.
So the big challenge, the nut they're trying to crack here, is doing reinforcement learning during inference. When you don't have the answer sheet right, how can you possibly reward the model correctly if you don't know the ground truth for the specific problem it's working on right now? It seems almost paradoxical.
It does, doesn't it? Because standard RL, the kind we've used successfully before, really leans heavily on knowing what's right or wrong to provide that reward signal.
So how do they solve it? You mentioned the model's own answers.
Exactly. They had this insight. What if the model's collected output, when you ask it the same question multiple times, holds the key? The consensus answer, the majority vote, could maybe act as a good enough proxy for the truth.
A sort of wisdom of the internal crowd.
You could put it that way, yeah. And it turns out surprisingly effective.
Okay, so the paper positions TTRL within this broader trend called test time scaling, or TTS. Maybe give us a quick refresher on why TTS is relevant here for our technical audience.
Sure. So test time scaling is this emerging idea that maybe spending more compute when the model is actually being used at inference time is sometimes more valuable than just scaling up the initial pre-training phase.
So instead of just relying on the massive pre-training, you do extra work tailored to the specific task at hand.
Precisely. You optimize performance for that specific test data. TTRL fits right into this philosophy because all the learning, the RL part, happens using the test data itself.
And we know RL, reinforcement learning, is already a big deal for reasoning tasks, right? Getting those chains of thought right.
Definitely. A lot of the top reasoning models already use RL, often trained on large data sets, to refine how they think step by step.
But the problem, as we said, is when they hit new data, unlabeled data, at test time, the old RL training might not quite cut it.
That's the bottleneck. Those RL techniques usually need those carefully crafted reward signals from labeled training data. You can't easily get that for every possible new scenario or data set.
And just labeling everything, especially for complex math or science problems, it's just not feasible at scale.
Exactly. The cost, the time, the expertise required, it's prohibitive.
Which leads to this idea of test time training, TTT, trying to update the model using the test data. But again, the reward problem, how do you give rewards without labels?
You've hit it. TTT is conceptually appealing, adapt on the fly. But without ground truth, defining that RL reward signal is the massive stumbling block.
Okay, so TTRL emerges as the bridge here. It wants to combine test time scaling and test time training using RL, but only with the unlabeled test data.
That's the synthesis.
Yeah.
It's performing RL right there at test time using the unlabeled inputs it's facing, which is pretty neat.
All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts for the engineers and researchers listening. How does TTRL actually work, step by step?
Okay, so first, you give the model a prompt, the problem to solve.
Standard stuff.
But instead of just getting one answer, you make the model generate multiple candidate outputs. You sample from it several times. Think of it like asking it for a few different ways to solve the problem, or a few different potential answers.
So generating diversity first. Okay, then what?
Then comes the key step. Label estimation via majority voting. You take all those different answers the model generated, and you find the one that appears most often.
The consensus answer.
Exactly. That most frequent answer is treated as the predicted correct label. It's not guaranteed to be right, of course, but it's the model's best collective guess based on its own outputs.
That's really clever. Using the model's own uncertainty in sampling to generate a target. So how does that predicted label turn into a reward?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. Once you have that majority voted answer, you go back to each of the individual answers the model generated initially.
Right.
And you give a reward of 1 if answer matches the majority vote and 0 if it doesn't. Simple as that.
So reward alignment with the internal consensus.
Yep. Aligning with the crowd gets a thumbs up.
And then the model uses those self-generated 1s and 0s to actually update its own parameters via reinforcement learning, like during the test.
Exactly. It runs an RL optimization step using these rewards. The goal is to tweak its internal policy so that next time it's more likely to generate answers that align with that majority consensus. It's learning to be more consistent with its own best guess.
It's essentially learning to trust its own aggregated judgment more.
You could say that. It's refining its approach based on this internally derived signal.
Let's dig into that majority voting reward at M a bit more. Could you walk us through how that algorithm actually functions based on the paper's description?
Sure. So the function takes in all the different output sequences the model produced for one prompt. For each sequence, it first extracts just the final answer part.
Okay. Isolates the actual result.
Then it counts how many times each unique answer appears across all the sequences. The answer with the highest count is declared the majority answer.
Got it. Finds the mode.
Right. Then it goes back to the original sequences. If the final answer extracted from a sequence matches that majority answer, that whole sequence gets a reward of 1. If it doesn't match, it gets 0.
So sample, find most common answer, reward the samples that hit that common answer. Makes sense.
That's the core loop for generating the reward signal.
Okay, clear. Now, the experiment, super important. What models did they actually use to put TTRL through its paces?
They used a good mix, mainly the Qt 2.5 math models, but the 1.5 billion and the 7 billion parameter versions that help see how it scales.
Right. Does bigger mean better here?
And they also included LLM 3.1 API Instruct, which is, a different model family, instruction tuned, to check if TTRL works more broadly.
And the tests themselves, what kind of challenges do they throw at these models?
They pick some tough ones. 3 well-known math reasoning benchmarks.
Yeah.
AIME 2024, that's notoriously hard. AMC, the American Math Competitions and Math 500. These really require deep reasoning.
Not just simple arithmetic, then.
Definitely not.
How did they measure success? What were the key metrics?
The main one was pass at 1 accuracy. So after TTRL has done its thing, does the model get the answer right on its first try? That's a pretty standard way to evaluate these reasoning models.
Makes sense. Clean measure.
They also reported AVG at 64, which looks at the average performance across all 64 samples they generated initially. Gives you a sense of the overall improvement in the sampled outputs, not just the final best guess.
And crucially, what did they compare TTRL against? What's the baseline?
Well, the most direct baseline is just the original model before TTRL. That shows you the pure self-improvement gain.
Right, the delta.
Yeah. They also compared Quinn models to their instruction-tuned versions. And importantly, they put the results alongside some top models trained with traditional RL on large labeled datasets, the R10-like models.
But that's more for context, right? Because TTRL's setup is different, no labeled data for these test tasks.
Exactly. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison methodologically, but it shows where TTRL stands relative to heavily supervised approaches. It highlights that TTRL is punching above its weight, considering its unsupervised nature at test time.
Any key implementation details on the RL side that our audience might want to know, like algorithms, hyperparameters?
Yeah, they used the GRPO algorithm for the RL updates, mostly, applied it separately for each benchmark, used AtomW optimizer, constant learning rate. They sampled 64 responses initially, temperature 1.0 for diversity.
So encouraging exploration first.
Right. Then used 16 of those for the actual RL update. They mentioned a vote then sample trick for efficiency. Max length was around 3,000 tokens, KL coefficient 0, and the number of training episodes varied depending on the dataset.
Okay, quite detailed, thanks. So the big reveal. What were the main results? Did TTRL actually deliver?
Oh yeah, the results were pretty striking. TTRL consistently gave significant performance boosts across most models and tasks.
Like that 159% number.
Exactly. That was for the Qwen 2.5 Math 7B model, On the AIME 2024 benchmark, a 159.3% relative increase in pass at 1 accuracy. And remember, that's purely from running TTRL on the unlabeled AIME test set itself.
That's staggering, just by using the test data itself.
Across all 3 math benchmarks, that same 7B model saw an average gain of about 84%. So really substantial improvements achieved in this self-supervised test time manner.
Wow. Okay, did they see that scaling effect you mentioned? Did bigger models benefit more?
They did, particularly on AIME and AMC. The 7 billion parameter QN model got a bigger boost from TTRL compared to the 1.5 billion parameter one.
Any intuition why?
The thinking is that the larger models, having seen more data and having more capacity, are probably better at generating a useful initial set of answers. Their majority vote signal might just be cleaner, more reliable.
So a better teacher signal for the RL process.
Potentially, yeah. More knowledge to bootstrap from.
Were there cases where it didn't work so well? Any exceptions?
Yes, a couple. The smallest Quen model, the 1.5B one, and also the Llama 8-bit struct model, didn't see big gains on AIME 2024, the hardest benchmark.
Why might that be?
The paper suggests it might just be down to model capacity or prior knowledge. If the base model is already struggling significantly with the complexity, the self-generated rewards might be too noisy or misleading to drive effective learning for those really tough problems.
So you need a certain foundation of competence for TTRL to build upon effectively.
It seems that way, especially for the most challenging tasks.
What about generalization? If you train with TTRL on, say, AMC problems, does it help the model solve AIM problems better? Or is it just overfitting to the specific test set?
That was a really interesting part of the analysis. They trained TTRL on one benchmark, then tested the updated model on the other benchmark that it hadn't seen during TTRL.
Okay, out of distribution testing.
Exactly. And they still saw significant performance gains across the board. This strongly suggests TTRL isn't just memorizing answers for the test set it trained on. It seems to be learning more fundamental improvements in reasoning ability that generalize.
That's huge. It implies real learning, not just temporary adaptation. Do they look at different RL algorithms that use GRPO, but would others work?
They did a check on that. They tried PPO, another popular RL algorithm, on the Math 500 benchmark.
And
the results were quite similar to GRPO. PPO actually seemed a bit more stable during training and achieved comparable performance. So it suggests TTRL isn't locked into one specific RL algorithm. The core idea seems compatible with different policy optimization methods.
Good to know it's potentially flexible. Now, a critical point. Training without ground truth.
Yeah.
How do you even know if the TTRL process is working, if it's learning anything useful during that test time phase? What metrics can you track?
Yeah, that's crucial since you can't just check accuracy against answers you don't have. They tracked a few things during the TTRL process itself. Things like entropy, basically, how much randomness or uncertainty is in the model's outputs. They also tracked the average majority voting reward itself. Is the model getting more rewards over time? And the majority ratio, how often does a clear majority answer emerge?
Ah, so process metrics rather than outcome metrics.
Exactly. By watching how these metrics change over the TTRL episodes, they could get a feel for whether the model was converging or learning effectively, and use that to pick the best checkpoint, all without needing any ground truth labels during that phase.
Okay, so they could monitor the learning dynamics. Now let's go to the really deep question for the researchers listening. Why does this actually work? The paper digs into this, right?
It does. They try to answer that from a few angles. First, just how well can it work? And surprisingly, TTRL can actually push the model's final pass at 1 accuracy beyond the accuracy of the initial majority vote signal it started with.
Wait, how it outperforms its own training signal?
Yeah, it sounds weird, but they argue that converting those pseudo-labels from the majority vote into RL rewards provides a richer, possibly more effective supervisory signal than just the raw majority vote accuracy itself.
Interesting.
And even more striking, they show that TTRL performance can get surprisingly close to what you'd get if you could cheat and train with the actual ground truth labels from the test set, what they call RL leakage.
So it's remarkably efficient at self-improvement.
Very efficient. And it works even for smaller models to some extent, which points towards possibilities for, continuous learning without massive resources.
Okay, that's impressive potential. But why? Why does learning from potentially noisy, self-generated rewards work so well?
Well, partly, RL algorithms are known to be somewhat robust to noisy rewards. They don't always need a perfect signal.
Right, they can handle some fuzziness.
Plus, there's this idea that maybe rewards generated by the model itself, based on its current understanding, might actually be more informative for guiding its next learning steps than a perfect external label sometimes. It's more tailored guidance.
That's a subtle point. The paper also mentioned rewards being denser than labels. What does that mean in this context?
Think about it. Even if the majority vote answer is technically wrong, giving a reward of 0 to all the other answers that also don't match that majority vote provides useful negative feedback.
Ah, I see. So even if the target is slightly off, you still get lots of signal telling the model these other paths were definitely not it.
Exactly. You get more learning signals per batch compared to just knowing if the single final answer was right or wrong. It provides more frequent updates, even if the direction isn't perfectly calibrated by ground truth. They have a little toy example showing this effect.
And then there's that really counterintuitive idea that a weaker model making more diverse mistakes might actually lead to better reward estimation, at least initially.
Yeah, that one makes you pause. The logic is, if a weak model produces lots of different kinds of wrong answers, it's less likely that any single wrong answer will accidentally become the majority vote. So, more of the truly incorrect answers will correctly receive a reward of 0 because they won't match the possibly also incorrect but different majority voted answer. The diversity of errors prevents a consistent wrong consensus from forming easily.
So the noise helps create a better negative signal.
In a way, yes. The paper shows data where the reward accuracy, how often the O1 reward matches what it should be based on ground truth, can start quite high. Even when the label accuracy, how often the majority vote is, the ground truth is much lower.
Fascinating. The model's initial incompetence helps it learn better, but it can't work miracles. When does TTRL fail or struggle?
Two main situations they highlight. First, if the base model just doesn't have enough foundational knowledge for the task's complexity.
The point you made earlier about the smaller models on A.
Exactly. If the problems are way over its head to start with, TTRL might not find enough signal to get going. Their Ablation study on Math 500 difficulty levels showed TTRL worked better on easier problems within the set.
Needs some initial grip on the problem. What's the other limitation?
Hyperparameters. Like any RL method, TTRL is sensitive to how you set things up, especially the sampling temperature, how much randomness you allow when generating initial answers, and the number of training episodes.
Get those wrong and it doesn't work.
Yeah, they showed examples where, say, the temperature was too high, leading to too much randomness, high entropy, or they didn't run enough training episodes for the model to explore and learn properly. Getting that balance right is key.
Standard RL challenges then, but applied in this test time context. Before we wrap, how does TTRL fit into the bigger research picture? They mentioned test time scaling and RL for reasoning again.
They see it as sitting right at the intersection. It takes the TKS idea of improving performance at inference time, but it specifically uses RL, which is known to be good for reasoning. And crucially, it adapts RL to work without labels at test time.
So a novel combination of existing threads.
A novel and potentially powerful combination, yeah. It pushes towards more autonomous AI that can adapt and learn from new, unlabeled data it encounters.
Okay, let's boil this down. Key takeaways for our audience of researchers and engineers from this deep dive on TTRL.
I think the main takeaway is this. TTRL is a genuinely new technique, allowing LLMs to self-evolve on complex tasks using only unlabeled test data. The majority voting reward mechanism is clever and surprisingly effective.
And it leads to significant performance gains, sometimes even catching up to supervised methods without the need for labels at test time.
Precisely. That potential to reduce reliance on labeled data while enabling continuous learning is probably the most exciting implication.
So for the folks listening who are deep in the trenches with LLMs, what's particularly intriguing, or what doors does this open?
Well, it definitely opens doors for thinking about continuous adaptation. How can models keep getting better as they encounter new data in the wild? TTRL provides one mechanism. The effectiveness of self-supervision here is also quite striking.
Right, and the potential to scale this, maybe integrate it into larger systems.
Absolutely, and applying it to different types of models, different tasks, there's a lot to explore. It also raises deeper questions about how these models represent knowledge and how self-generated signals can refine that representation.
Does the paper suggest specific next steps or open questions? Where does the research go from here?
They do. They mention needing more theoretical analysis. Why exactly does it converge, under what conditions? Also exploring it for online learning with streaming data, using it for large-scale pre-training or fine-tuning, not just test time.
Expanding its scope?
Yeah, and applying it to more agentic tasks. Maybe even scientific discovery, where you often operate without clear ground truth. Lots of avenues.
Okay, so a final thought to leave you with. This idea of models learning and improving significantly just by processing unlabeled test data, using their own internal consensus. What does that really mean for the future? Are we moving towards AI that can genuinely learn and adapt autonomously in the real world without constant human hand-holding and labeling?
It certainly feels like a step in that direction. TTRL demonstrates a powerful mechanism for self-improvement.
Definitely something to chew on. We encourage you to check out the paper for all the details. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.